So as we just discussed with Dave Weigel, there's being a lot here made of Kamala and her attack on Donald Trump in the closing days is all about character. So that has really come into focus with some more recent allegations by General Kelly, former Trump chief of staff. Kamala Harris took advantage of that at a town hall yesterday. We're going to show you more of the town hall later in the show, but we wanted to start with this part specifically. She says Donald Trump is, quote, a fascist. Let's take a listen.
We know that is why Mike Pence is not running with him again, why the job was empty. And then today we learned that John Kelly, a 4-star Marine general, who was his longest serving chief of staff, gave an interview recently in the last 2 weeks of this election, talking about how dangerous Donald Trump is. And I think one has to think about, why would someone who served with him, who is not political, a 4-star Marine general, why is he telling the American people now? And frankly, I think of it as he's just putting out a 911 call to the American people. Understand what could happen if Donald Trump were back in the White House. And this time, we must take very seriously those folks who knew him best and who were career people are not going to be there to hold him back.
You've quoted General Milley calling Donald Trump a fascist. You yourself have not used that word to describe him. Let me ask you tonight, do you think Donald Trump is a fascist?
Yes, I do.
Yes, I do. All right. So all of this comes back from to General Kelly, who was the chief of staff, longest-serving chief of staff under Donald Trump. A lot of these comments came to light in an Atlantic article with Jeffrey Goldberg. I will reserve some of the problems with that article for a little bit later and at least just play the audio from General Kelly himself. This was audio that he is allowed to be released from the New York Times talking about this alleged incident. Let's take a listen.
He would he commented more than once that, you know, that Hitler did some good things too. And of course, if you know history, again, I think he's lacking in that. But if you know what Hitler was all about, it'd be pretty hard to make an argument that he did anything good.
So what would you say when he said to you that Hitler did a lot of good things?
Well, I tell him that. I said, you know, sir, first of all, you should never say that. But if you knew what Hitler was all about from the beginning to the end, everything he did was in support of his racist, fascist life, philosophy, so that nothing he did you could argue was good. It was certainly not done for the right reason, and but he would occasionally say that.
What would he say when you would lay that out to him?
He'd just, that would be the end of the conversation usually. Certainly, the former president is in the far right area. He's certainly an authoritarian, admires people who are dictators. He has said that. So he certainly falls into the general definition of fascist, for sure.
If he was left to his own devices, would he be a dictator if he didn't have people around him?
Oh, I think he'd love to be. I think he'd love to be just like he was in business. He could tell people to do things and they would do it, and not really bother too much about whether what the legalities were and whatnot.
All right, so there you go. Do we want to react to this, Krystal, before we play this? She made a big moment about this. There's a press conference yesterday at the vice presidential residence. We were on pins. We're like, oh, what is it? It could be something big. She's going to come out. She's doing a press conference. She almost never does a press conference. Didn't end up taking any questions. It was only like, maybe a few minutes recounting these comments. But what we seem to take away is that because that article had come out from The Atlantic, there was not as much media coverage, I think, as the Democrats would have liked about it. So she was trying to force the conversation, both with, I think, the fascist term and then also trying to get people, I guess successfully, for us to talk about it, because that is her closing argument now with 12 days to go. It's full-on character, January 6th, dictatorship. I mean, listen, I think it's been tried before. I don't think it's going to work, but I'm curious what you think.
Well, it did work in 2022.
I mean, yeah, but he wasn't on the ballot. So,
I mean,
and that's what I just keep going back to.
So let me just say,
he wasn't on the ballot.
My own political bias is that this is not a smart strategy. That is my bias, is to buy into the research that Matt Cart brought us on the show that shows that, the most effective messaging with swing voters in the state of Pennsylvania is about populist policies and progressive economics. I do have to say, I think her closing ads that Weigel referenced when we just talked to him focused on taxes and Trump being for the billionaires. I do think that that is an effective pitch. And so my political bias is to look at this and go, listen, people who think Trump is a fascist, in my opinion, accurately, they are already in your camp. You're not really persuading anyone. But, I have to say, I was wrong in 2022, so I do have some humility about my own assessments. So let me talk about the political strategy a little bit, and then, we can also talk a little bit about the substance here. On the political strategy, Weigel mentioned something that hadn't really occurred to me, which is that it's her doing this big press conference yesterday at the vice presidential residence, her plan to do the big closing speech in the ellipse where January 6th occurred. This is, yes, it's about the message itself, but it's also about, I look presidential. You can imagine me in this role. And they feel like that is still a question that remains for some voters who don't like Trump, but are not sure that they're ready to vote for Kamala Harris. And that kind of landed with me as oh, that's an important part of what they're doing here. Trump is trying to go hang out with the bros and say, look, I'm not this scary, dangerous character that they're painting me out as. Here I am hanging out. How scary can I really be? And her focus in the waning days is envision me as president. And look, we haven't ever had a female president before. And she has been knocked rightly at plenty of times as kind of a lightweight. So that kind of landed for me as part of the thinking going into this. In terms of the messaging, their theory, which again goes against my own views and instincts on these things, but hey, you never know, maybe they're right. Their theory is that there exists a quote-unquote shy Kamala voter who is kind of like the Nikki Haley voter, right? Who is a conservative woman who has voted Republican most of her life, whose husband is likely voting for Donald Trump, and who is in a lot of circles in her community where everybody is basically a Republican and supporting Trump. And she really can't come out publicly and say she's supporting Kamala Harris, and maybe needs a little bit of a reminder of, this is who this guy is. Remember January 6th? Look at the people who served with him. Mattis, Milley, now Kelly, all coming out and saying, hey, I was in the room with this guy. I actually saw how he operates. And yeah, your worst fears that he is actually a fascist are true. And by the way, yes, okay, plenty of bad things did happen last time around, but the Republic did not end. But guess what? This time, we're not going to be there. It's going to be all the loyalists. They're going to use, Schedule F to dismantle the administrative state. So whatever institutions and checks and bulwarks and inhibitors were there last time are going to be gone. And it's just going to be, there's a whole project, concerted project. That's the real takeaway from Project 2025. There's a concerted project to make sure that none of those restraints from last time are in place. So that's their theory of why they're leaning into this messaging, because they think, number one, Kamala needs to put herself in these sort of presidential settings and prove herself there as this tough, credible leader. And number two, because Trump's approval ratings have ticked up a bit, you need to remind people of what it was that they found most disturbing about him last time that he held the office, and make the case that next time around he would actually be worse.
Yeah, I think that's the only interpretation we can come away from. I feel so distanced from this campaign. Usually I can feel and understand why people are doing what they're doing. Back in 2020, the Biden basement strategy, criticized it a lot, obviously, on empirical merit, but it was the correct strategy, right? It was obvious. This one, I just don't get it. I mean, I understand the 2022 thesis. I understand that coalition, they They really believe they can bring it out. But in an era where Donald Trump increased the amount of votes that he got by almost 10 million in 2020, has always had a track record of driving out these lower propensity voters and shaking up the political establishment. Maybe there's not evidence for it, but there's been so many polling misses, and there's still so many things that could happen. I mean, nobody saw the Latino shift in Texas and elsewhere happening back in 2020. It was a shock on election night. It was one of the biggest shocks I experienced. I don't know. I mean, maybe. You know, it's one of those where, is it really going to land? It just seems so played out, so driven home by the media. To me, I mean, I called it on Twitter the Jennifer Rubin campaign. Like, to me, it really is like the apotheosis of this Jennifer Rubin, like, media critique that the media actually doesn't talk enough about how Trump is a fascist. I saw yesterday, it was like Van Jones was like, Kamala has to be flawless while Donald Trump is lawless. And yet, you know, yeah, I know. But went on his Instagram and he's like, it's feeling like 2016 again. You got to get out there and vote. Like, we're looking down fascism in the barrel. And I mean, the whole country experienced 2017 to 2021 when Trump was actually president. None of that stuff happened. Their argument is, well, it'll be different this time around. But people look back on those years actually quite fondly. And then even with Trump people himself, a big criticism, including mine, would be that he did have people like General Kelly, Mattis, and others who didn't agree with him on anything, and who at many times actively thwarted a lot of his better orders, like to withdraw from Afghanistan or whatever. So I just look at it as very different from theirs. Of course, they're not trying to win me over. That coalition, I just keep thinking, aren't these people Harris voters already? Aren't they already Democrats? Like, who is being convinced by this? But look, if they win by one in all the blue wall states, I'll say it right here, they were right.
I mean, the difference between 2020 and now is that in 2020, January 6th hadn't happened.
Yeah, true.
So it was, you know, I mean, you could point to, like, Trump did weaponize the Department of Justice against, you know, launching investigations against John Kerry and against Comey. And it's not like there was nothing you could point to, but there was nothing as shocking as what happened on January 6th. And, you know, and now we've learned more and more details about, no, he really was serious about, for example, calling the military in to shoot protesters in the legs during the Black Lives Matter protest. He really was serious about these plans to attempt to, like, use the National Guard to seize ballot boxes. He really did try to overturn the election using these fake elector slates. We really did watch a crazed mob run around the Capitol calling for his own vice president to be hanged, and him sit back and, you know, allow it to happen, if not be actively, like, in support of that sentiment. So, you know, that is a significant shift from where we were back in 2020, which even in 2020, obviously he lost. So even before people had that incredibly jarring experience. So again, my instinct is similar to yours, Saagar, and it was in 2022, to be like, I don't know why you're focused. Like, to me, I think this is important, right? I think actually the argument is correct that, you know, all of any sort of institutional guardrail and check that was in place that checked his worst instincts last time around, they have made a concerted effort to dismantle those. You also have a Supreme Court decision basically saying, hey, whatever you do in office, basically you're immune. Like, you can do basically whatever you want. So it is a different landscape in that regard. That resonates with me. My instinct is to say you were better off when you were framing him as, like, weird versus this, you know, giant threat. You're even better off when you're leaning into bread and butter issues, inflation, which we have to say, too. I mean, she's closed the gap with him on economics. So some of what she's saying is landing. But I can't be so certain about it because their analysis was more right in 2022 than mine was. And I think what Weigel points to is they've effectively already baked into the calculus, like, we're losing Arab American voters. We're just going to try to make it up somewhere else. We're not going to hit our margins with Black men in particular. We're also going to try to make that up somewhere else. And they're saying, all right, well, where do we make that up? The largest group of voters in the country is white people, and white women in particular are the single largest demographic group. So if we can pull in another couple percentage points there, then it's enough to make it work, especially in the blue wall states. And, you know, I can't say definitively that they're wrong about that.
Again, extraordinarily possible. It just seems like such a tremendous gamble. Like I would, you know, if we're gambling and we're looking at margins and ways to win, it just seems totally different, both the way I would do it and others. I mean, I guess why I come back to it in terms of why it's all baked in is we have heard this all so many times. And by the way, I would point out, this whole Atlantic article has some serious like issues. Let's put A6, please, on the screen. Nick Ayers, who I covered at the White House and was the deputy chief of staff while General Kelly was also the chief of staff, says, quote, I've avoided commenting on inter-staff leaks or rumors, but General Kelly's comments regarding President Trump are too egregious to ignore. I was with each of them more than most, and his commentary is patently false. There is an anecdote in the Atlantic article which alleges that Trump didn't want to pay for this soldier's funeral. The sister of that fallen soldier says that is absolutely not true. The reporter who was in the room during their meeting says absolutely not true. Now, all these people have certainly an incentive, right?
Mm-hmm.
But Nick Ayers, it was like some never Trump Mike Pence type guy who I covered at the White House and eventually left. He is not in any way some sort of like MAGA warrior. So when the guy says it's a lie, like I tend to believe it. At the end of the day, only General Kelly and Donald Trump actually know what was allegedly said in some private conversation. You can make up your own mind.
Can I ask you though, like, we weren't there. I wasn't. Like, it is just like a he said, he said. Does it strike you as outlandish though that Trump could say? Like, to me, it's not that crazy or unimaginable, given some of the things he said in public, that he could have said something like this. And so, you know, it doesn't like blow my mind to imagine him being like, you know, I want some generals like the German generals. Yeah. That sounds very much like something Trump would say.
But doesn't that kind of lose when he's like, even listen to what Kelly says, he's like, I want somebody who takes orders. It's like, well, I mean, for example, let's think about what may be the context. Like maybe when Trump was like, hey, you need to withdraw from Syria, and James Mattis and the Pentagon hide the number of troops in Syria and don't withdraw them and execute a lawful order. Like, well, which side would you rather have? The person who actually obeys the commander-in-chief or not? Like, that's what I mean.
But why you got to go to Hitler's generals?
Okay, the point is about, I mean, by the way, you know, I've been trying to avoid this discussion, but, you know, what's his name? Kelly brought up, he's like, oh, did you mean Bismarck's generals? Did you mean the Kaiser's generals? Or did you mean Hitler's generals? There is a discussion to be had about who the best generals were between Bismarck, Kaiser, and Hitler or whatever. Don't forget, Heinz Guderian was never prosecuted by the Nuremberg trials. He was the chief of staff of the Wehrmacht under Hitler. So all I'm saying is that if you actually look at so-called like the context of I'm trying to issue orders or whatever, yeah, don't you want a general officer who does obey like the whatever the order, a lawful order at least from the president? Probably.
So you also would like Hitler's generals?
No, I didn't say I would like Hitler's generals, but I'm saying it's a stupid.
You're backing him up.
What I'm saying is it's a stupid and a contrite way of being like, oh, it is evidence that he would like pursue a Holocaust or some sort of like ridiculous and the most smearing way. We have to be adult in the way that we can talk about that conversation.
Of course.
So like what I just pointed out with the Syria thing is a perfect example of why I like Schedule F. I'm like, yeah, it's good. Get them out of there. These people actively subvert the commander-in-chief. Bigger than Trump too. This is a Biden problem. This is an everybody problem.
The last time we discussed this, you know, you said you had you thought Trump would be basically a dictator if he could. I don't want to put words in your mouth.
I said Trump would pursue many of the most outlandish things if he could. But I have enough faith in American institutions that that's not going to happen.
So to me, the issue with that analysis to me is that you can't on the one hand say like, oh, well, the institutions held last time and he was held in check by the way, some people like Kelly and Mattis, et cetera, and Milley. But also, I want none of those people in this administration, and I want them to actively destroy the institutions that did keep him in check last time. And also, it also leaves out the fact that the landscape is different since you have the Supreme Court decision that basically says you're immune for acts that you take in office. So to me, that's kind of trying to have it both ways of saying, yeah, well, the institutions held last time, but also I don't want those institutions around this time to hold them in check.
Very easy to explain. In terms of, what is it? Like, what did you reference? Like shoot people in the leg or whatever? Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's not going to happen even under so-called Schedule F. But the example I gave of, hey, you need to withdraw from Syria, and then they fake the numbers, specifically in the Pentagon, and then give them false information to the commander-in-chief and don't carry out that order, I think that needs to go. That's what I'm talking about.
But why?
I don't think that those are actually mutually exclusive at all.
Why are you so confident that so last time when Trump was like, why can't the military just come in and shoot protesters in the legs or something? That was, what he said, which I believe that he said that. You had Milley in place to be like, you can't do that.
Yeah.
Right. And the whole goal of the, Project 2025 and many of the most organized conservative efforts in the meantime is to make sure that you don't have someone like Milley in place who can say, like, no, we're not doing that, that you have, quote unquote, loyalists. Like, that's Trump's number one goal. You see it already, in the choice of like J.D. Vance as vice president. The number one goal is to make sure that the people who are in place this time will do whatever he says, whether it is appropriate, lawful, moral, or not. And so that's why I don't think you can have so much confidence that, like, if he's, wants to go in that direction next time, you're going to have someone in place who's going to be like, no, you can't do that. And, the context of John Kelly, the quotes that we played for you, the audio we played for you, that was in an interview with the New York Times. He apparently, this reporter had been trying to get him on the record for a really long time. And he didn't want to do it. And then what he says triggered him to come out now is Trump's repeated comments about using the military against the enemy within. And for him, a bright red line, which it should be for all of us, in my opinion, in American public life, is turning the military against civilian populations. So when you know what he tried to do last time, when you know what he's saying publicly, when people who know him way better than we do and have been around him and seen him in action way more than we have, when all of them are saying this, like, it's, whether you want to use the F word fascist or not, like, this guy is a wannabe dictator and really could be very dangerous next time around. I can't hand wave that away, given what we've seen him already do at this point.
I understand, but it just substantively seems very different to me than, okay, let's say the theoretical chain of command for you need to go shoot people on American streets. You would need the general to carry it out. You would need to pass it down to the National Guard, and the individual soldiers would actually carry that out. Call me crazy, too optimistic, don't think it's going to happen.
But we did see protesters quite viciously attacked out front of the White House during the Black Lives Matter protest.
Those were by the D.C. police, not on the order of the president or the National Guard.
It was the National Guard. There were federal law enforcement officers there. It was right outside the White House. Yes, but it was
done by the D.C. Metropolitan Police Department.
You're forgetting it was done in the service of enabling that bizarre Trump photo op with the Bible. Yeah. So that was done at Trump's behest. And that it was at a time, yes, I know plenty of the protests were violent. It was at a time, they were completely peaceful. And, they were viciously attacked. So I just, to say it's impossible and I can't imagine it happening, et cetera, given what we've already seen, I just don't have that confidence.
And that's fine. People can vote the way that they want. There's a big difference to me between D.C. cops and local cops tear gassing some people to get them out of a square or whatever so Trump can take a photo op and literally trying to shoot people and occupy the country. Like, if you believe that, then frankly, I have my whole voting guide today. Go vote for Kamala. If you don't believe that and you think it'll work its way out in the way that I laid out in terms of the president's going to issue an order and we're going to actually see the deep state or whatever maybe come to heel and execute these orders, then you should vote for Trump. Or don't, it's up to you. But my point is that it seems very clear that there's obviously like an Overton window within what we're talking about here, and that this idea of literally shooting people or enemy from within camps of U.S. citizens is not going to happen. If you believe it's going to happen, then don't vote for him. I really don't know what to tell you. Like, that's the argument that I think is very clear. I think that's how the government should work, specifically both within the bounds and then also, disobeying so-called unlawful orders. What I saw when I covered the White House is that General McMaster, General Kelly, and General Mattis willfully undercut the president of the United States and tried at every turn not to execute his foreign policy. My criticism of Trump actually would be that you're such a fool that you allowed them to do so for 2 years and that you didn't use the full force of your office to say, who are you? Get out of here. The guy comes in, he says, I want to withdraw from Afghanistan. McMaster's like, no, you need to surge in Afghanistan. And Trump signs that off. So that's my criticism of Trump. But that's not the criticism that media and Kelly and all these other people were. It's very much like, oh, you need to trust me, because I was some 4-star general. And that, that's another thing. What, these 4-star generals, like, what, you think they're the greatest people in the world? I covered the Pentagon. They're some of the biggest liars out there. Go look at the way that they all talked about Afghanistan. Like, why would you trust exactly what everything these people say? This isn't even about General Kelly per se, but it's like anytime some general on CNN or whatever is like talking about his past service and how we're supposed to revere them, I just can't help but think the Afghanistan papers and I read about him. Every single commander of the U.S. forces in Afghanistan lied to the American people. So what credibility do you have with me? So I guess it just comes down to like what you really think is going to happen within this specific situation, and also whether you find these people as eminently credible and you want them to run the country.
So
for me, absolutely not. I don't want these people to run the country.
What do you make, though, of the fact that so many of the people who, who supported, voted for Trump last time, who were lifelong Republicans, who were, as comfortable enough with his leadership that they were willing to serve in his administration, that they all have very similar things to say?
I make of it exactly what I just said. I think that they're they're deep institutionalists, that they have a committed internationalist worldview, having covered and even been in off-the-record conversations with General Kelly, with General Mattis, and all these other people. They saw their role as very specific. We need to protect the Republic from Donald Trump. I don't think that these people should be, quote unquote, protecting a Democratic elected leader from anything, or the Republic, quote unquote, from a Democratic elected representative. For example, Mattis saw his entire role as stopping Trump's blunt America first instincts. And don't forget, resigned over what? Over the Syria withdrawal order that eventually came to a head. General Kelly, same thing. General McMaster, same thing. They saw their role as basically—
Mike Pence?
So what's up?
How about Mike Pence?
Well, Mike Pence is a different story. And actually, I think that criticism is pretty legitimate. I've never sat here and been some stop and
That's
steal
the thing
defender.
is what they're saying is honestly very similar to what Mike Pence is saying. And, I would have put a lot more stock in the argument you're making prior to January 6th. And, we were very lucky that at that time there were still a few people to tell Donald Trump no, that it wasn't even, worse than it ended up being. And it was a horrifying day. It was bad. Like, the attempt to steal an election was really bad. So I just can't be so blasé at this point of like, oh, I don't want anyone around who is an institutionalist. I want Donald Trump to be able to exercise his most unchecked impulses this time around. I just can't at this point.
I get where you're coming from. I laid out my January 6th position.
But it didn't change your
the January 6th?
Your analysis at all?
Oh, of course. But what happened then was the result of the democratic process, right? Well, let's look at the current landscape of January 6th and whether it can happen again. The Electoral Count Act is passed. The vice president can no longer have any ambiguity on certifying the election. 5 out of the 7 swing states are ruled by Democrats, which would require certification under the Electoral Count Act. So that's not going to happen. Number 3, Rudy Giuliani and all of the other legal associates who helped Trump do this are literally bankrupt. Rudy was ordered yesterday to turn his Mercedes over to the Department of Justice. Jenna Ellis had to plead guilty. Sidney Powell had to plead guilty. They're all completely bankrupt. What's his name? John Eastman has basically been run out of town. I believe he's either been disbarred or not. I forget. Rudy's been disbarred. Every person who's been connected to that has suffered massively at the hands of the state, and Trump himself is under federal indictment, and it's not like he didn't pay a price for it. So do I think it's going to happen again? No, I absolutely don't. This is a case of genuinely institutions coming together, I think in a totally legitimate way of trying to constrain the universe where anything like this could happen. So that's what I would say. I'm not that worried about that playing out like this again. If you want to say an extraordinary circumstance of something different, okay, maybe. Again, I think within the bounds of the system, people have really learned their lesson from January 6th. And if they haven't, then I think they're going to pay a big price for it. So that would be my response on a lot of that. Like, just mechanically, a lot of the things that happened last time cannot happen again. And if they want to sue in state court and lose every single case like they did last time around, be my guest, I guess. You want to waste some legal fees? Fine.
It just feels like you're talking about, okay, the exact set of circumstances that led to the exact situation of January 6th have been somewhat mitigated, so we don't have anything to worry about. And when I think about that, about the events of January 6th and Stop the Steal and all of that, it's less about, okay, can that exact sequence of events happen again? I don't know. Probably not, because he's not president right now, so that makes things different right there. But is that indicative of the type of thing that he can foment when he's at his worst? Yes. And is that indicative of, when you put that together with what many people who were in his administration, including his own vice president, who stood by him through everything up until the very end, what they say about his worst impulses, I think that is I think that is very troubling and should be taken seriously. And then, you know, the last thing I'll say, and we can move on to Kamala's town hall and take a look at what she's saying in her closing pitch and also some of the latest polls. But the last thing I'll say is also, you do have a different landscape now with the Supreme Court really saying, like, you have carte blanche. And so even that theoretical institutional check of, you know, the highest court in the land is now effectively gone. So if you're taking that away, you're taking away any of the people who were, like, you know, institutionalists who were writing memos to him saying, you know, like Don McGahn writing memos to him saying, listen, you cannot just turn the Department of Justice into your own, like toy to prosecute your political enemies. You just literally can't do that. You take those people out of the picture, and you know, I think it is a dangerous situation and one that people should take into consideration. Now, I'm not telling people how they have to vote or that this has to be their number one issue, et cetera. But, you know, to factor in the people who were in the room with him, who saw how he operates and how he thinks, and to take into consideration what we've seen happen and his own public comments. You know, I don't think it's like deranged or insane to take those things very seriously, given what we've seen at this point.
I don't think it's deranged or insane. People can make up their minds for themselves. Hey, if you like that video, hit the like button or leave a comment below. It really helps get the show to more people.
And if you'd like to get the full show ad-free and in your inbox every morning, you can sign up at breakingpoints.com.
That's right. Get the full show. Help support the future of independent media at breakingpoints.com.